Chapter 51. Dawn had chased off the storm. The downpour had washed away much of the gruesome effects of the battlefield, and the sun glistened on the remaining gladioli. The colorful sword flags stood battered and ragged, but still turned their heads toward the rising light. Dare shielded her eyes against the early light with her arm. She and Kelin had slept on the battlements. They hadn't meant to. They had taken a turn on guard like everyone else on the walls, and when that was done, they'd collapsed. Her mind nudged closer to consciousness. Something lifted her elbow. She groaned and rolled over, falling back into bliss. Then her ears recognized the metallic scrape of someone moving a blade across the stone. Her eyes flared open, and she awoke with the force of a sitting person leaping to a full sprint. Blindly, she grabbed at whatever was there. An elf jerked his arm out of her hand. "Don't fret, girl. The battle ended last night." She stared at him until the trickle of memory flowed into a pool. Oh yes, Pena, the physician from her first encounter with the elves. She grumbled. Carrick and Striggle had gone off to do something with Boyson's body. Jacob had started yelling at Spike, and the horse had started arguing back. That part was probably just a dream. "Try not to move," the physician sighed. "Some of those cuts may open again the moment you stretch." He rubbed something into a fresh scar on her arm, still pink with pain. "What's this?" She forced herself not to flinch away. "Yarrow and cobwebs. They'll clot the blood." She frowned. "That's what we use at home. I thought you elves would have some ultimate healing ointment or something, like you did before." "Of course we do," he snapped. "It's just that I'm saving that for those who need it. You don't. And that wasn't an ointment before. My surgery is art." He rolled his eyes. She squinted in the brilliant sunlight. "Oh." She retracted her arm and tried to roll back over. The physician snatched her shoulder. "No, stay awake. You can rest again after I'm done." She kept her eyes closed as she propped herself up against a battlement. She wasn't ready for daylight yet. "Once again, you've been lucky." He held her elbow. The skin beneath his hand warmed, and the spectacular scrape and bruise disappeared. The surgeon sighed. "I don't know how when you're so stupid." "I'm brave, not stupid." "Well, if you're brave, then you are stupid. You can't separate the two." She smiled. "Ah, but you can omit one." "Did you doubt me?" Jacob shifted his weight as Thistle stared at him. The elf ran a hand through his clipped hair and looked down at Thalon, who was clutching his father's leg. They stood in an empty, open corridor, but it wouldn't be vacant for long. He shook his head, but Spike, standing behind him, kicked his armored calf with a hoof. The elf exhaled. "Yes, I doubted you as well." Jacob smirked mirthlessly. "Although you were supposed to break us out of prison, not be the one who put us in there." He frowned. "But yeah, I know how deep the loyalty to Vlad and Dis ran. They made sure their people survived once upon a time." The Kemen snorted. "Vlad was far too trapped in his victory, and too passionate in the moment to be a good leader. As for Dis, well, he was never as smart as he thought he was, a very human trait. Neither of them were true Kemen either. Not sure if there is such a thing." He hinted at a smile and patted his son's shoulder. "But I think we should be going. Have you had that wound seen too?" The knight glanced at Thistle's hip. The Kemen nodded. Spike coughed and raised a hoof. Jacob rolled his eyes. "Oh, all right. You know that you both are still prisoners of the Silver Dawn Dragoons. It's my duty to keep you as such and to make certain that you are not mistreated and get fed and all that. But I'm busy after this battle. Quite busy. Busy making sure the lady's all right," Thalon quipped. Jacob kept a straight face, but flushed, while beside him Spike pawed the ground. The knight said, I could just delegate some of my duties and have enough time to keep one eye on you." Thistle placed a hand on his son's head. "He'll be good. He'd better be." Jacob turned, but then paused. "I have to know. How did you escape the first banishment?" Thistle held his gaze. "Because the water of life I have is Laurel's, and she had mine. Neither of us were fully elven or Kelin when the spell crashed down." "I see." Thistle shrugged. "Others may have found ways around this banishment if they weren't here at moonrise. This one only sealed off Darkreign. It didn't remove the Kelin from this world, and there may be others elsewhere. We're aware. But Lady Eve and the Prince did not have the resources that Valadin and Maiden had." Thistle nodded. "I hope they are out there." He continued as Jacob scowled. "They must change their ways to survive, and I want them to finally learn for themselves. And for the others in Darkreign, maybe now that they're free from Blade and this, they'll become different. I wish I could aid them." His gaze dropped to Thalin. "But for now, I cannot. Unlike the rest of them, I choose family." Jacob slapped Spike's massive shoulder. "Well, I'm leaving to check on my soldiers, and I forgot to post a guard on the tree path for the next hour. My mistake." Dare sighed again and banged the back of her head against the wall they were leaning against. She and Kelin waited in the chamber outside Lady Evelyn's courtroom. She allowed a hand to fall to the Palin's sword. She had scrounged a sheath that fit it. He rolled his head toward her. "Don't tell me you're moping because the war is over." "Nah," she scowled. "But I have this question. Ever since we left home..." He lifted an eyebrow. She let the weight of her head rest on the wall and looked up at the ceiling. "And the only one I can ask, aside from being an evil deity, seems to be insane." "Are you sure it's not you?" He frowned. "Being insane?" "No." She stared at the ceiling. "I don't think so, at least. When this all began, when those riders came to town, I heard his voice." Kelin said, "You never said the priest spoke to you." "No," she whispered. "Not the priest." He blinked. Then his throat wobbled, and after a moment he belched out a laugh. Dare glared at him. "Do you think this is a joke?" His laughter faded to chuckles. "No, but, well, it's just not as terrifying as it should be. And honestly, I'm not surprised because it's you. I was." She crossed her arms. "He called me his enemy. He has me confused for someone else, but what does that make me? And the second time he spoke to me..." "Second time?" Dare stiffened. After a moment, Kelin drawled, "What did his unholiness say?" She forced her shoulders to appear relaxed. "Not much, but I have a promise to keep now. To try something that someone failed to do long ago that he seems desperately opposed to." "But it was never you in the first place, as you said." She shrugged. "Something still needs to be done. But..." She stretched her arms out in front of her. "Dark deity is going to have to wait on me. I will claim my answers, but they need to be hunted, so I need to become a hunter." Dare... He shook his head at her, and what was left of any smile faded. "You carried me out of the burning forge. You carried me out of a Kelin dungeon, and now you've carried a lost king to his throne. You're a hero. It's what you've always been." He turned to fully face her. "So why are you chasing these dark dreams?" Her brow narrowed, and her expression became pained. "I have to know." "Do you, really?" He inhaled as if to say more, but then he blew out a sigh and stretched. "Fine. That's your call, as crazy as it is." "Thanks. As for me, I don't have any grand ideals or allegiances to pledge. But I know I can stand on my own now, and I am enough when people need help." He straightened. "And I can be the one to choose when to do it. I'm sorry, Dare, but I'm not following you anymore. Especially if you're attempting to chase down a devil." She raised her eyebrows. Without a word, she smiled at him and nodded. He chuckled. And I've been thinking that perhaps the world outside River's Bridge isn't so bad. Yes, and now that you've seen the world, you may return to your village. Duke Farallon breezed into the antechamber, trailed by several other elves. If you don't want to wait for the snows to melt in the mountains, we can send you through the tree paths. Kelin bowed his head. You were generous, my lord. He just wants us gone. Then Dare scratched the back of her head and pushed herself away from the wall. She lifted her eyes to the piercing gaze of the elven lord. Your Dukeness, I have to admit that, well, to you, I was wrong and I'm sorry. And I'm also sorry that I wished that you were the traitor. Farallon snorted and crossed his arms. At least you now understand that you were wrong with every step you made for the duration of this emprise. He and his entourage swept past them toward the court and opened the lacquered doors. Dare frowned. Hey, I apologized. They ignored her and snapped the doors back into place. Jacob emerged from around a corner, moving silently for a large man in plate armor. Dare, you must have eaten a bowl full of lemons. Kelin chuckled. She's fine. Good. She shook herself free and glanced around. Where are Thistle and Thalin? Jacob shrugged. What does that mean? Don't ask, is what it means. Oh. She deflated. Kelin rubbed his neck. Before this, he sighed, the Kemen were just another campfire story. Senna and his cultists weren't even that to us. Dare frowned. They're another problem. We need to... Jacob slapped her shoulder. You need to get trained first. He tapped his chin. Do you think you can be a warrior, Dare? She fought to keep a stern expression, but felt her pride swelling. Sure, her plan had been altered and had shattered apart like a falling star, but she didn't care. She had proven herself. Yes? Why? He frowned thoughtfully. Many fighters aren't warriors at heart. Both have the experience, but the thing that separates the two is the willingness to do it again. He took a step toward them. If you were given a choice, would you make this journey a second time? You can't change how things happen. The torture, the deaths, the betrayals, the victories, and the defeats. Every wound made bright again and every bitter emotion resurrected, but this time you know how much those will hurt. Would you? Kelin closed his eyes. No. Dare bore a horrified expression. Her voice was dredged up from the back of her throat as if she were dragging her tongue. Yes. Jacob's face brightened. Then I might be able to arrange something for you. Maybe in a few years. What? Her grin became hopeless. I mean, I'll already be 18 when next summer comes around. Jacob blinked. And you went on that raid at 17? That's too young. Kelin scratched his head. You must have known this, sir. We are human. You children are way too young for this. When I started, I was much younger. Damn, but back then it was gladiators, goblins, and brigands, never Kemen. She held up a finger in defense. Most girls my age are getting wed. The knight ran a hand over his face. Marrying infants. What's next? Do you want me to answer that, sir? No. He clapped his hands together. Well, my work here is done. Wait. Dare tensed. You're not going to the coronation? Dare, the knight laughed. That won't be for at least a century, and that's rushed for them. There's never been a coronation before, understand? But don't be mistaken, as of now, he is king. He straightened. Meeting you two was an adventure, and I hope we cross paths again, Derora, Kelin, under more favorable circumstances. You're leaving? Kelin asked. Just like that. Yeah. He nodded. Best time before all the ridiculousness starts. He waved a hand toward the court. And we're moving our troops home. He turned, but paused. "Dare, you guard that sword." Then he started to march away and nearly plowed into the dwarves coming up the hall. Carrick hid behind Striggle as Jacob disappeared. Wisps of beard poked out from Striggle's sides. The first dwarf grunted. "Well met." "Well met," Kelin replied, leaning to the side to peer around Striggle's body. Carrick stepped out, wearing his spectacles and a beard. It was silky and wasn't the same color as the rest of his dark hair. He even had strings tied to his ears. Kelin and Dare both slapped hands over their mouths, while Carrick's face reddened to a bruised shade. Kelin flattened out his smile. "I'm glad to see that you're well. What are you going to do now that the Kemen have been vanquished and you're free?" The dwarf shrugged. "Don't really know. Return to Warkiln, I suppose." "What's that?" Kelin persisted. Carrick's eyes lit up. "The great dwarven stronghold. Oh, its halls are glorious and much larger than these skinny elven buildings." Dare's eyes glossed over, but Kelin's came alight. The dwarf waggled his massive eyebrows. "You are most welcome to travel there with us. Come, celebrate Candlebright." "Oh, maybe. Midwinter's still a while yet," Dare said. "I will." Kelin glanced at her. "I think this is the first thing that I actually want to do since this whole disaster began." "Then you should." She grinned. The lacquered doors opened of their own accord. Inside the room, an array of flower petals flowed like a water fountain in the center, displaying an endless stream of colorful patterns. A simple wooden throne sat on a small dais under a glass dome that let in the daylight. Today, Lady Evelyn stood to its side. Farallon and the Duchess waited on the opposite armrest. Other elves streamed into the court. Lastly, Edelon and his brother entered from a far door. Alsalon sidled up beside Lady Eve just as Edelon took the wooden seat. He wore the cleaned, spiky crown of Indeleria. It shimmered and seemed to carry its own inner glow. His voice slid through the air like a smooth whine. "My thanks to you for coming here. Without all of you, neither my brother nor I or our kingdom would have survived. I know that lives have been lost, and we will never again meet our loved ones, but we stand here today in victory, not in defeat." He let his gaze settle on the crowd. "I am not a complete person, but I know who I want to be, and I want to take that journey with those in this room. You have earned my respect through blood, sacrifice, and faith in me. You have given me the belief that life can heal and can become better than it is today." He raised a hand. "To whom we failed to speak with since the wars, the dwarves, I wish to extend a new hand of friendship." Striggle and Carrick shuffled forward and bowed. Edelon intoned, "We cannot replace your friend. I am sorry for his death, as sorry as I am for one of my own. We've both lost people, but we've regained something we've lost." Carrick bowed, his fake beard touching the floor. "Yes, your majesty, we have. We are happy to carry your invitation to the clans." He raised his head and melted back into the crowd. Edelon's face remained commanding. "I need to praise Lady Evelyn of Elowen for closing the paths to Darkreign. My lady, there is no gift I can give you that will repay you." She curtsied. "There is no gift you can give me that I require." He nodded and turned to Farallon. "Thank you, my Lord Duke. I know I put you through much." The older elf bowed his head. "Thank you for keeping your faith in me, my king. I ask that I stay by your side through the coming years." Edelon smiled. "I would have asked it of you anyway, my lord." Then he turned back to the gathered people. "I also need to thank those who put themselves knowingly in the Storm Reader's power in order to bring them to this battle." He looked around. "I do not see Sir Jacob, and that red armor can't be missed, so I would call forth Finan and Selinian." The two elves stepped forward and bowed. Prince Alsalon handed each of them a ring. "These rings will keep you warm, no matter how cold the world around you becomes." They closed their hands over the treasures. They bowed and turned back into the mass of people. Kelin Miller of Riversbridge, please present yourself, Edelon commanded. Trembling, Kelin ducked his face and slunk toward the dais. Prince Alsalon came forward and offered him a single-edged, curved sword, hilt first. Kelin grinned. It looks like... No, it's not like the one I got in Riversbridge. That one looked like a child's drawing of this. He accepted the sword in both outstretched palms and bowed his head. Edelon smiled. This sword will break enchantments and is enchanted never to break itself. May it be worthy of you. Thank you, he stammered, and retreated to the dwarves and Dare. Edelon smiled and passed his gaze on to Dare. What could I give the ever-insolent Derora Saxen? She sauntered forward. I don't know, Majesty. You and Kelin gave me hope and wisdom about both life and death. Thank you. You're welcome. She beamed. He lifted his hand to reveal the handkerchief her sister had made for her all the way back in Riversbridge. It seemed over a year ago. The king opened his mouth to speak, but Dare interrupted. Keep it. It's dried your tears more than mine. Edelon held her gaze. Then he smiled. I accept your gift with humility. She grinned. Of course. He raised a hand. You've found a weapon of Palin's, so how about something to go with it? Alsalon thrust forward a small, silver necklace in his hand. She fingered the slender medallion and stared. He dropped its weight into her palm. It was the most perfect circle she'd ever seen, bisected down the center by the outline of a sword. It looked as if it could snap apart in her fingers, but it felt sturdy at the same time. This is the Dawn Sword. Edelon nodded to it. Carinth's warrior symbol, and also the symbol of a warrior of Palin's. May you serve it well. Thank you. She smiled. Alsalon reached for the Palin's blade. My brother says we can give it a fitting home here in the meantime. She rocked back half a step and placed a hand over the crossguard. So it sits on a velvet pillow like the rest of the Palin's stuff you have? Edelon's eyes widened. You're going to use it? Well, the Kemen took my other sword. Again. She cocked a grin. He blinked in surprise. Derora, you can't carry the weight of the Empire alone. She tightened her hand on the blade. It doesn't seem heavy.
It was probably a paladin's sword,
Alsalon burst. He was grinning.
I've read all the stories.
Dare's face flushed red and then white. But paladins don't exist anymore. They all died with the Empire. It's most likely not, children, Farallon grunted. Then his tone softened. It's amazing enough in the fact that it's from Palin's. It should be protected and cared for. No. She sighed. Edelon was still watching her, Farallon was scowling, and Lady Eve was smirking. She shuffled her feet and raised the necklace in her hand. Do you want this back, then? Edelon pursed his lips. Then he shook his head. It's a gift. Thank you. She folded her fingers over the Dawn Sword, bowed, and stepped back into the crowd beside Kelin. Edelon raised his chin and cast his gaze out over everyone, pulling their attention to him. As we've resurrected the Dawn Sword today, I am reminded of King Maiden's words. I have never been a believer in the divine right to rule. One may gain a throne by divine appointment, but he can only retain it through his own wits and worth. I think we've shown our wits and proved our worth on the battlefield. I have learned how this kingdom is worth more than one immortal's life, even a king's. I solemnly promise to be a ruler worthy of you, like my father and mother. Their leadership cannot be replaced, but we have learned from it. My parents, however, did not give their lives for this kingdom. They died for my brother and me. Throughout this adventure, I've learned... His voice became a whisper, rippling through the air. That death, that which we have once again forgotten to know, is bittersweet. I still love my former king and queen, and I love this land that they built, and I will still celebrate this love. even though it is so painful to bear. My pledge is to always bear this burden, and to always serve my kingdom." Around the new king, cheers as loud as a storm echoed off the walls and thundered toward the sky.